Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you're listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will revisit history of political philosophy. I've been looking at essays from this book quite a bit. I've gone through some of the stuff from the Enlightenment period. Looked at Thucydides recently, and now let's dip into Plato. I reviewed a book about Plato last episode, and so this episode is going to cover a little bit of the same ground, but some additional stuff as well. So some of this may be familiar topics from last episode, but not all of it. This essay is written by Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss and Joseph Cropsey are the editors of this book, and they each wrote some of the essays, but there are a lot of other writers as well. But this one is the first one that I have covered that is written by Leo Strauss himself. So we get to see a little bit of Leo Strauss's impression of Plato here in this essay. He talks a lot about the Republic. Unsurprisingly, the Republic is such a famous book by Plato. But as I said in the last episode, the Republic is a thought experiment, and it is not exactly a proscription for an actual city. Plato's not saying, here's my idea for what we should literally try to make our city be. It's a couple of young thinkers. Socrates, of course, is the lead voice in the dialogue, but he's laying out his idea of a perfectly just city and what it would look like. And he doesn't take into other considerations like whether it's feasible or whether it would violate any other sort of desirable trait for the city. He just aims at the totally just city, the perfectly just city. And I think that it's often the case that people look at this and they really take it to be a political theory. And it's not exactly that. Plato did write another book later in his life. Most scholars agree that this other book, The Laws, was written later in Plato's life. And The Laws is much more of an attempt to actually sketch out a real city that would realistically be possible. It's a few people discussing the founding of a city, and they're talking about what that city is going to look like in the dialogue. So the premise of the dialogue of The Laws is a little different, and it's a little more serious. It's a little more of an actual attempt to construct a city, to construct a constitution and lay out the laws of what the city will look like. And so he talks about the Republic in this essay. He also talks about the Laws. I'm not really going to talk much about the Laws. I haven't read the Laws, and so I'm going to read a little bit about the Laws, but mostly I just want to deal with the Republic. He talks a little bit in here about Plato's theory of forms, or his theory of ideas, depending on, it's referred to in both ways. But a lot of what I'm going to talk about is just going to be revisiting some of the stuff that gets covered in the Republic, and kind of see where Leo Strauss, what his opinions are about some of these things. So, like all my episodes, I'll be reading a few sections, and I'm going to provide a little bit of feedback about what I'm reading. I want to talk about some of the early sections, like I did in the last episode, about Kephalos and Thrasymachos. There's different spellings on these. The last book was Thrasymachos, ending in US. This one is Thrasymachos, ending in OS. Similarly, Kephalos was spelled with a C in the last one, and here it's spelled with a K. I find that odd. But nevertheless, I'm going to read here a little bit about the opening section when he's talking to Kephalos, and I'll move on from there. So, in this section, he says, quote, "The conversation opens with Socrates addressing a question to the oldest man present, Kephalos, who is respectable on account of his piety as well as his wealth. Socrates' question is a model of propriety. It gives Kephalos an opportunity to speak of everything good which he possesses, to display his happiness, as it were, and it concerns the only subject about which Socrates could conceivably learn something from him, about how it feels to be very old. In the course of his answer, Kephalos comes to speak of injustice and justice, He seems to imply that justice is identical with telling the truth and paying back what one has received from anyone. Socrates shows him that telling the truth and returning another man's property are not always just. At this point, Cephalus' son and heir, Polemarchus, rising in defense of his father's opinion, takes the place of his father in the conversation. But the opinion which he defends is not exactly the same as his father's. If we may make use of a joke of Socrates, Polemarchus inherits only half, and perhaps even less than half, of his father's intellectual property. Polemarchus no longer maintains that telling the truth is essential to justice. Without knowing it, he thus lays down one of the principles of the Republic. As appears later in the work, in a well-ordered society, it is necessary that one tell untruths of a certain kind to children and even to the adult subjects. This example reveals the character of the discussion which occurs in the first book of the Republic, where Socrates refutes a number of false opinions about justice. This negative or destructive work, however, contains within itself the constructive assertions of the bulk of the Republic. Let us consider from this point of view the three opinions on justice discussed in the first book. Cephalus' opinion, as taken up by Polemarchus after his father had left to perform an act of piety, is to the effect that justice consists in returning deposits. More generally stated, Cephalus holds that justice consists in returning, leaving, or giving to everyone what belongs to him. But he also holds that justice is good, i.e., salutary, not only to the giver, but also to the receiver. Now it is obvious that in some cases, giving to a man what belongs to him is harmful to him. Not all men make a good or wise use of what belongs to them, of their property. If we judge very strictly, we might be driven to say that very few people make a wise use of their property. If justice is to be salutary, we might be compelled to demand that everyone should only own what is fitting for him, what is good for him, and for as long as it is good for him. In brief, we might be compelled to demand the abolition of private property or the introduction of communism. To the extent to which there is a connection between private property and the family, we would even be compelled to demand abolition of the family, or the introduction of absolute communism, i.e., of communism not only regarding property, but regarding women and children as well. Above all, extremely few people will be able to determine wisely which things and which amounts of them are good for the use of each individual, or at any rate for each individual who counts. Only men of exceptional wisdom are able to do this. We would then be compelled to demand that society be ruled by simply wise men, by philosophers in the strict sense, wielding absolute power. The refutation of Cephalus' view of justice thus contains the proof of the necessity of absolute communism in the sense defined, as well as of the absolute rule of the philosophers. This proof, it is hardly necessary to say, is based on the disregard of, or the abstraction from, a number of most relevant things. It is abstract in the extreme. If we wish to understand the Republic, we must find out what these disregarded things are and why they are disregarded. End quote. Okay, so that's pretty heavy right there. He's saying that, well, Socrates has made it a point to refute Cephalus and Cephalus' argument that justice is giving to each person what they're owed or what belongs to them. So the idea, and I had mentioned this in the last episode, it's brought up in the book, where if someone owns a sword and they loan it to someone else, and then they're in a fit of rage and they want to murder someone unjustly, or they've lost their mind, they've gone insane, or for whatever reason, they want to get the sword back and commit a crime, commit a murder. They want to murder somebody unjustly with the sword, and they want to get their sword back, and it's not justice to give the person his sword if he's going to go off and do something evil with it. So, in that sense, the private property of the person is superseded by what is best for him or what is best for other people who are involved with him. It involves a sort of judgment that the person who has the sword is making an evaluation of whether or not that person really deserves to get their sword back because of what they might do with it. But as Leo Strauss says here, well, where would you draw the line? If it's really about, justice is always what is good for you. Justice is never something that's bad for you or bad for the person that you're dealing with. So someone has to evaluate what's in other people's best interest. The person who owns the store has to make an evaluation of what is in this other person's best interest. Should they get their sword back? Yes or no? And likewise with all other things, that private property really isn't a value that's held here by Socrates. And as we see later in the book, when it turns out that, yes, in fact, women and children are not allowed to be paired up in the family unit. Women are all in common, children are all in common, in the sense that they belong to the state. All the women and who they're paired with, the marriage making, the sexual pairing, all of this is controlled by the state. The children, who raises them, how they're raised, is all controlled by the state. So it's the same thing extended further on down the road. And there are other restrictions about private property and things that are in the Republic. And it's setting up somebody has to be wise enough to be able to make these decisions. And that's where we get our philosopher king. Someone has to be able to have total control, who is wise enough to make decisions about who really gets what in their own best interest. So right off the bat, he dismisses and he says justice is actually has nothing to do with private property or who owns what, but it has everything to do with someone making decisions, some wise person making decisions about what is best and implementing their decisions. So that's pretty interesting. That's a pretty interesting take. And I think, I'm not a really big fan of the Republic, and I think that some of the ideas are just out there or not good ideas. And I think Leo Strauss is right on board here. Is this is not actually a sort of justice or a vision of justice that we should adopt. So let's move on from there. So we started with Cephalos. Cephalos' son is Polemarchus, and we saw a little bit about how his son carries on the argument. So in this section he says, quote, Cephalos' opinion is linked in his mind with the view that injustice is bad because it is punished by the gods after death. This view forms no part of Polemarchus' opinion. He is confronted with the contradiction between the two opinions, according to which justice must be salutary to the receiver, and justice consists in giving to each what belongs to him. Polemarchus overcomes the contradiction by dropping the second opinion. He also modifies the first. Justice, he says, consists in helping one's friends and harming one's enemies. Justice, thus understood, would seem to be unqualifiedly good for the giver and for those receivers who are good to the giver. This difficulty, however, arises. If justice is taken to be giving to others what belongs to them, the only thing which the just man must know is what belongs to anyone with whom he has any dealing. This knowledge is supplied by the law, which in principle can be easily known by mere listening. But if the just man must give to his friends what is good for them, he himself must judge. He must be able to correctly distinguish friends from enemies. He himself must know what is good for each of his friends. Justice must include knowledge of a high order. To say the least, justice must be an art comparable to medicine, the art which knows and produces what is good for human bodies. Polemarchus is unable to identify the knowledge, or the art, which goes with justice or which is justice. He is therefore unable to show how justice can be salutary. The discussion points to the view that justice is the art which gives to each man what is good for his soul, i.e., that justice is identical with, or at least inseparable from, philosophy, the medicine of the soul. It points to the view that there cannot be justice among men unless the philosophers rule. But Socrates does not yet state this view. Instead, he makes clear to Polemarchus that the just man will help just men rather than his friends, and he will harm no one. He does not say that the just man will help everyone. Perhaps he means there are human beings whom he cannot benefit, but he surely also means something more. Polemarchus's thesis may be taken to reflect a most potent opinion regarding justice. The opinion according to which justice means public spiritedness, full dedication to one's city as a particular society, which as such is potentially the enemy of other cities. Justice so understood is patriotism, and consists indeed in helping one's friends, i.e. one's fellow citizens, and harming one's enemies, i.e. foreigners. Justice thus understood cannot be entirely dispensed with in any city, however just, for even the most just city is a city, a particular or closed or exclusive society. Therefore Socrates himself demands, later in the dialogue, that the guardians of the city must be, by nature, friendly to their own people, and harsh or nasty to strangers. He also demands that the citizens of the just city cease to regard all human beings as their brothers, and limit the feelings and actions of fraternity to their fellow citizens alone. The opinion of Polemarchus, properly understood, is the only one among the generally known views of justice discussed in the first book of the Republic, which is entirely preserved in the positive or constructive part of the Republic. This opinion, to repeat, is to the effect that justice is full dedication to the common good. It demands that man withhold nothing from his own city. It demands, therefore, by itself, i.e., if we abstract from all other considerations, absolute communism. End quote. So once again, we come to this argument that justice, if it's played out to its natural conclusion, really represents communism, and it's the idea taken to an extreme that justice is helping your friends and hurting your enemies. There's no self-interest in that question, right? You help your friends, you hurt your enemies, and how do you deal with yourself? Well, you deal with yourself in such a way that helps your friends and hurts your enemies. So if that line alone is carried out, then you have to be able to differentiate who your friends are and who your enemies are. And that differentiation, it happens along the sense of public spiritedness. So what he says here, to repeat, what he says is, he does not say that a just man will help everyone. Perhaps he means that there are human beings whom he cannot benefit, but he surely also means something more. Polemarchus's thesis may be taken to reflect a most potent opinion regarding justice. The opinion according to which justice means public spiritedness, full dedication to one's city as a particular society, which is potentially the enemy of other cities. So what he's saying there is that one way to interpret Polemarchus is to simply say that, well, when it comes down to the city as a whole, the just city and the good functioning city, all of the members of the city are friendly with one another, and other cities, external cities, are potentially the enemies, but they're not to be treated in the same way. They're not to be treated as friends. The people in the city are your friends, and the people of the other cities are either neutral or your enemies. And that's the clearest, easiest way to sort of pin down for the whole city who the friend and who the enemy is. But taken to its extreme, it means total dedication to the city, or total dedication to the nation, or total dedication to the state. That the person has no self-interest any longer. All of their interest is dedicated to the city. And followed out to its extreme, the complete dedication to the common good becomes, yet again, communism. So then he talks a little bit about Thrasymachus. And he calls it the third and last opinion. The first opinion was Cephalos. The second opinion was a slightly modified version of Cephalos's, which was from Polemarchus, where the first one was giving to people what they deserve or what they're owed, what belongs to them. And the second was doing good things for your friends and harming your enemies. And then the third version is Thrasymachus' version. So here he says, quote, "The third and last opinion discussed in the first book of the Republic is the one maintained by Thrasymachus. He is the only speaker in the work who exhibits anger and behaves discourteously and even savagely. He is highly indignant over the result of Socrates' conversation with Polemarchus. He seems to be particularly shocked by Socrates' contention that it is not good for one to harm anyone or that justice is never harmful to anyone. It is most important, both for the understanding of the Republic and generally, that we do not behave toward Thrasymachus as Thrasymachus behaves, i.e. angrily, fanatically, or savagely. If we look then at Thrasymachus' indignation, without indignation, we must admit that his violent reaction is to some extent a revolt of common sense. Since the city as city is a society which from time to time must wage war, and war is inseparable from harming innocent people, the unqualified condemnation of harming human beings would be tantamount to the condemnation of even the justest city. Apart from this, it seems to be entirely fitting that the most savage man present should maintain a most savage thesis on justice. Thrasymachus contends that justice is the advantage of the stronger. Still, this thesis proves to be only the consequence of an opinion which is not only not manifestly savage, but is even highly respectable. According to that opinion, the just is the same as the lawful or legal, i.e., what the customs or laws of the city prescribe. Yet this opinion implies that there is nothing higher to which one can appeal from the man-made laws or conventions. This is the opinion now known by the name of legal positivism, but in its origin it is not academic, it is the opinion on which all political societies tend to act. If the just is identical with the legal, the source of justice is the will of the legislator. The legislator in each city is the regime, the man or body of men that rules the city, the tyrant, the common people, the men of excellence, and so on. According to Thrasymachus, each regime lays down the laws with a view to its own preservation and well-being, in a word, to its own advantage, and to nothing else. From this it follows that obedience to the laws or justice is not necessarily advantageous to the ruled, and may even be bad for them. And as for the rulers, justice simply does not exist. They lay down the laws with exclusive concern for their own advantage. Let us concede for a moment that Thrasymachus' view of law and rulers is correct. The rulers surely may make mistakes. They may command actions which are in fact disadvantageous to themselves and advantageous to the ruled. In that case, the just or law-abiding citizens will in fact do what is disadvantageous to the rulers and advantageous to the subjects. When this difficulty is pointed out to him by Socrates, Thrasymachus declares after some hesitation that the rulers are not rulers if and when they make mistakes. The ruler in the strict sense is infallible, just as the artisan in the strict sense is infallible. It is this Thrasymachian notion of the artisan in the strict sense which Socrates uses with great felicity against Thrasymachus. For the artisan in the strict sense proves to be concerned not with his own advantage, but with the advantage of others whom he serves. The shoemaker makes shoes for others, and only accidentally for himself. The physician prescribes things to his patients with a view to their advantage. Hence, if ruling is, as Thrasymachus admitted, something like an art, the ruler serves the ruled, i.e., rules for the advantage of the ruled. The artisan, in the strict sense, is infallible, i.e., does his job well, and he is only concerned with the well-being of others. This, however, means that art, strictly understood, is justice indeed, and not merely in intention, as law-abidingness is. Art is justice. This proposition reflects the Socratic assertion that virtue is knowledge. The suggestion emerging from Socrates' discussion with Thrasymachus leads to the conclusion that the just city will be an association where everyone is an artisan in the strict sense, a city of craftsmen or artificers, of men and women, each of whom has a single job which he does well and with full dedication, i.e., without minding his own advantage and only for the good of others or for the common good. This conclusion pervades the whole teaching of the Republic. The city constructed there as a model is based on the principle of one man, one job. End quote. So I talked about this a little bit in the last episode, but there's really a disconnect here with the idea that all of these various individuals are acting, the artisans are acting with the best interest of the recipients of their art in mind. The shoemaker is serving the person who's going to receive the shoes. And the physician is acting in the best interests of the patient. But what we fail to recognize is the same thing that we failed to recognize with the shepherd. Although it's not so dramatic here, the shoemaker makes shoes because he's getting something for them. He's getting paid for those shoes. In some way, even in a totalitarian scenario, he's making shoes because he has to make shoes, because someone's forcing him to make shoes. In a capitalist society, he's making shoes because he's going to get paid for them. There is no scenario in the real world where the shoemaker is just making shoes because he just really cares about other people's feet and making sure other people have the best shoes. Now, there may be some degree of pride in one's craft and the desire to make a good shoe, the desire to have satisfied customers, if you will, as a sense of pride. But really, just like the shepherd is tending the flock for his own benefit, the shoemaker is making shoes at the end of the day so he can feed his family and keep a roof over his head. Now, how does this tie in with justice? Well, the question really is, Thrasymachus puts forward that in a sort of cynical way that justice is whatever is to the advantage of the powerful. And this is closely related to the idea that justice is obeying the law, because the people who are in power are the ones who create the laws, and they create laws that are going to work in their own advantage. And so long as people are obeying the law, then they're acting to the advantage of the people who make the laws, or the people who otherwise hold political power. The question comes up, well, if someone makes a law, if a king makes a law that doesn't actually benefit him because he doesn't understand the situation, or he's not that bright, or for whatever reason he makes a law as a mistake that isn't to his own advantage, but instead is to the advantage of the ruled, then is it justice to obey the law? If it is, then you're no longer acting in the benefit of the ruler. Now, Thrasymachus responds to that concept and says, well, insofar as they're making mistakes, then they're not really a ruler in that moment. They're just a failed ruler. They're someone pretending to be a ruler, impersonating a ruler. But they're only an actual ruler when they rule well. And he tries to connect this to say, well, a shoemaker is only really a shoemaker when he makes a shoe correctly. To the extent that he makes a shoe incorrectly, then in that case, he's not a shoemaker. He's a mistake maker. He's a bungler. But when he makes the shoe correctly, then he becomes the shoemaker. And likewise with the ruler, when the ruler rules correctly, then he becomes a ruler. But what that correctly means to Thrasymachus, originally in the original argument, is that he rules correctly when he rules to his own advantage. Then that's where the question comes in, well, really, if he's ruling correctly, he's ruling to the advantage of the people. Neither of these are completely sufficient, and I don't think that in reality it's an either or. I mean, if you want to have an accurate view of leadership, to some extent they are creating rules that benefit them. When the people, if you live in a democracy where the people rule, then the people are creating laws for their benefit, but really the majority is creating laws for their benefit. The party, one party wins power in a two-party system. When one party wins power, they will craft laws that will benefit the constituents of that party. And when the other party gains power, they will craft laws to the benefit of that set of constituents. So, in a sense, that's true, but there's also, in order to maintain their positions of power, they also have to reward the city in some way. They have to protect the city, and they have to do things that are to the advantage of the city in order to maintain their power. So there is a sense in which they're ruling for the benefit of the ruled, so that their heads remain attached. It's a little bit of both, really. It's not just, I don't think, clearly one or the other. So this line of argument doesn't seem to land quite so squarely in communism. So then he goes on to talk about Glaucon. I talked a little bit about Glaucon in the last episode. I'm going to skip over that section for now and jump on to continue the line of thought where that last one ended about one man, one job, how the division of labor is set up in the city so that, the shoemaker just makes shoes. That's his gig. That's what he does. He makes shoes. He doesn't need to do anything else. He has a job, and that's it. If you are one of the auxiliaries, one of the defenders of the city, then that's your job, and that's it. If you're the philosopher king, that's your job. It's a real division of labor, and that was a major part, as we saw in the last episode, of what made the city just, was that the different parts of the city know what their roles are, and they engage in their roles, and they don't try to overstep their bounds. So there's a little bit more. I want to carry on with this a little bit as he's talking about how Socrates has sort of proposed a type of communism, and how Socrates continues to relate justice to theories that can potentially evolve into, if taken to their extreme, can evolve into total communism. And in fact, he does kind of argue for a very communistic place. And I want to address that a little, or look at how Leo Strauss addresses that in this section here, where he says, quote, "At the beginning of the 5th book, Socrates' companions force him to take up the subject of communism in regard to women and children. They do not object to the proposal itself, in the way in which Adeimantus had objected to the communism regarding property at the beginning of the 4th book, for even Adeimantus is no longer the same man he was at that time. They only wish to know the precise manner in which the communism regarding women and children is to be managed. Socrates replaces that question by the more incisive questions. 1. Is communism possible? 2. Is it desirable? It appears that the communism regarding women is the consequence or presupposition of the equality of the two sexes concerning the work they must do. The city cannot afford to lose half of its adult population from its working and fighting force, and there is no essential difference between men and women regarding natural gifts for the various arts. The demand for equality of the two sexes requires a complete upheaval of custom, an upheaval which is here presented less as shocking than as laughable. The demand is justified on the ground that only the useful is fair or noble, and that only what is bad, i.e., against nature, is laughable. The customary difference of conduct between the two sexes is rejected as being against nature, and the revolutionary change is meant to bring about the order according to nature. For justice requires that every human being should practice the art for which he or she is fitted by nature, regardless of what custom or convention may dictate. Socrates shows first that the equality of the two sexes is possible, i.e., in agreement with the nature of the two sexes, as their nature appears when viewed with regard to aptitude for the practice of the various arts. And then he shows that it is desirable. In proving this possibility, he explicitly abstracts from the difference between the two sexes in regard to procreation. This means that the argument of the Republic as a whole, according to which the city is a community of male and female artisans, abstracts to the highest degree possible from the highest activity essential to the city, which takes place by nature and not by art. Socrates then turns to the communism regarding women and children, and shows that it is desirable because it will make the city more one, and hence more perfect, than a city consisting of separate families would be. The city should be as similar as possible to a single human being, or to a single living being, i.e., to a natural being. At this point, we understand somewhat better why Socrates started his discussion of justice by assuming an important parallelism between the city and the individual. He was thinking ahead of the greatest possible unity of the city. The abolition of the family does not mean, of course, the introduction of license or promiscuity. It means the most severe regulation of sexual intercourse from the point of view of what is useful for the city or what is required for the common good. The consideration of the useful, one might say, supersedes the consideration of the holy or sacred. Human males and females are to be coupled with exclusive regard to the production of the best offspring, in the spirit in which the breeders of dogs, birds, and horses proceed. The claims of Eros are simply silenced. The new order naturally affects the customary prohibitions against incest, the most sacred rules of customary justice. In the new scheme, no one will know anymore his natural parents, children, brothers, and sisters, but everyone will regard all men of the older generation as his fathers and mothers, of his own generation as his brothers and sisters, and of the younger generation as his children. This means, however, that the city constructed according to nature lives in a most important respect more according to convention than according to nature. For this reason, we are disappointed to see that while Socrates takes up the question of whether communism regarding women and children is possible, he drops it immediately. Since the institution under consideration is indispensable for the good city, Socrates thus leaves open the question of the possibility of the good city, i.e., of the just city as such. And this happens to his listeners and to the readers of the Republic after they have made the greatest sacrifices, such as the sacrifice of Eros as well as of the family, for the sake of the just city. End quote. So it doesn't really seem like Socrates is making a tremendous amount of sense here, to be honest. What is natural and what is customary seem to be jumbled up and turned upside down. The supposition is that the family unit is a product of custom. And there's this argument that Socrates is making that the city should be structured according to the natures of people, right? Because he says, well, if a woman is good at a certain task, let's say a woman is a good fighter. It may be the case that some women are good fighters, and it may be the case that some men are poor fighters. And if you take the women who are good fighters and you don't let them fight, and you take the men who are poor fighters and you force them to fight according to custom, then you are going against their individual natures. They're not able to clearly and perfectly express their nature. The woman who's a good fighter is not able to express her nature as a good fighter. So in one sense, he's making an argument that the gender roles are an imposition, an unnatural imposition on people's nature, and that the city will be better served when people are allowed to pursue their nature. So just jumping back here, he says, the customary difference of conduct between the two sexes is rejected as being against nature, and the revolutionary change is meant to bring about the order according to nature. So that's one line in that section I just read. He says, for justice requires that every human being should practice the art for which he or she is fitted by nature, regardless of what custom or convention may dictate. Okay? So he's saying that the gender roles and the restrictions on what people do is against nature. Justice is best served when each person does what they're best fitted to do by nature. The person who's a good shoemaker should be a shoemaker. The person who's a good warrior should be a warrior. People fill, the roles that they're best suited for, according to nature. Which seems really like, in the whole scheme of things, not to fit in all that closely with what he's describing for the Republic. Like, the idea here is that when children are very small, someone is going to evaluate them and determine, oh, you're going to make a good warrior, so we're going to move you into the warrior class. You're going to make a good shoemaker. We're going to move you into the shoemaker class based on estimations of their capabilities when they're children. But is it the case that someone's nature as an adult is discernible completely when they're a child? Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe as they get older, they discover what their nature really is, but by then it's too late because the city has already set them down this one path. So the city's not really allowing people to express their nature as they uncover it or as they discover it. It's got its own kind of customary shape to it, and the premise that it has in some way is allowing people or encouraging people or is best served by people conforming to their own nature doesn't, I don't think, hold up an awful lot. And he does talk about how this whole premise that the city is a representation of an individual writ large. We can understand justice in the individual by looking at justice in the city. When he tries to craft the city, he tries to craft it in a way that it resembles an individual. In doing that, it has to be unified. Everybody has to think along one line. They have to all be on board with the same idea. They have to there can't be strife against one faction against the other because it breaks down the capacity to see the city as a sort of mega person. And part of that is the breakdown of the family unit. The more people don't have a dedication to the family unit, but instead they channel that dedication so that, well, all the older men are all like my father and all the children are all my children. That's this unity that's imposed through this mechanism in order to make the city more like one person. It's kind of contrived. But, what happens, he says, in the new scheme, no one will know anymore his natural parents, children, brothers, and sisters, but everyone will regard all men of the older generation as his fathers, etc., etc. This means, however, that the city constructed according to nature lives in a most important respect more according to convention than according to nature. Because according to nature, you do know who your parents are and who your children are. And it's the custom that Socrates imposes on the city that destroys the family unit, and it's the family unit which is natural, because a city is not a person. And insofar as he tries to craft a city that is equivalent to a person for the purpose of the analysis between the comparison between the person and the city, he annihilates the natural tendency of people to build family units. In a sense, there are different competing tasks here. One of them is for people to live according to their natures in order to kind of maximize the efficiency or whatnot. But that's really hampered by the other drive, which is to create a city that can be easily compared to an individual person. And so this is something that Aristotle talks about a little bit later on down the road when Aristotle begins to talk about politics. But the idea is just that, Socrates doesn't really answer the question of whether the communistic aspects of the relationships between men and women and between parents and children, this kind of communal living, whether it's good or whether it's possible, neither of those questions really get adequately answered. And the question of whether any of this is in accord with nature is an important one, because things that are too much in conflict with human nature lose their capacity to happen because people will resist against them by nature. Their nature will assert itself, and in so doing will break down the situation or the customs that are opposed to nature. So at this point, I do want to talk a little bit about the ideas, the theory of ideas. I haven't really talked about that. I didn't talk about that in the last episode. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I want to touch on it because, well, I think it's interesting and raises some interesting questions about what those ideas really mean. And it's also ties in with, I think, some religious questions. So he says, quote, Socrates is not for long allowed to escape from his awesome duty to answer the question regarding the possibility of the just city. The manly Glaucon compels him to face that question. Perhaps we should say that by apparently escaping to the subject of war, a subject both easier in itself and more attractive to Glaucon than the communism of women and children, yet treating that subject according to the stern demands of justice and thus depriving it of much of its attractiveness, he compels Glaucon to compel him to return to the fundamental question. Be this as it may, the question to which Socrates and Glaucon return is not the same one which they left. The question which they left was whether the good city is possible, in the sense that it is in agreement with human nature. The question to which they return is whether the good city is possible, in the sense that it can be brought into being by the transformation of an actual city. The latter question might be thought to presuppose the affirmative answer to the first question, but this is not quite correct. As we learn now, our whole effort to discover what justice is, so that we would be enabled to see how it is related to happiness, was a quest for justice itself, as a pattern. By seeking for justice itself as a pattern, we implied that the just man and the just city will not be perfectly just, but will indeed approximate justice itself with particular closeness. Only justice itself is perfectly just. This implies that not even the characteristic institutions of the just city, absolute communism, equality of the sexes, and the rule of the philosophers, are simply just. Now, justice itself is not possible in the sense that it is capable of coming into being, because it is always without being capable of undergoing any change whatever. Justice is an idea, or form, one of many ideas. Ideas are the only things which, strictly speaking, are, i.e., are without any admixture of non-being, because they are beyond all becoming, and whatever is becoming is between being and non-being. Since the ideas are the only things which are beyond all change, they are, in a sense, the cause of all change and all changeable things. For example, the idea of justice is the cause for anything, human beings, cities, laws, commands, actions, becoming just. They are self-subsisting beings, which subsist always. They are of utmost splendor. For example, the idea of justice is perfectly just, but their splendor escapes the eyes of the body. The ideas are visible only to the eye of the mind, and the mind, as mind, perceives nothing but ideas. Yet, as is indicated by the facts that there are many ideas, and that the mind which perceives the ideas is radically different from the ideas themselves, there must be something higher than ideas, the good, or the idea of the good, which is in a sense the cause of all ideas, as well as of the mind perceiving them. It is only through perception of the good, on the part of the human beings who are by nature equipped for perceiving it, that the good city can come into being and subsist for a while. The doctrine of ideas which Socrates expounds to Glaucon is very hard to understand. To begin with, it is utterly incredible, not to say that it appears to be fantastic. Hitherto, we have been given to understand that justice is fundamentally a certain character of the human soul, or of the city, i.e., something which is not self-subsisting. Now we are asked to believe that it is self-subsisting, being at home, as it were, in an entirely different place than human beings, and everything else that participates in justice. No one has ever succeeded in giving a satisfactory or clear account of this doctrine of ideas. It is possible, however, to define rather precisely the central difficulty. Idea means primarily the looks or shape of a thing. It means then a kind or class of things, which are united by the fact that they all possess the same looks, i.e. the same character and power, or the same nature. Therewith, it means the class character or the nature of the things belonging to the class in question. The idea of a thing is that which we mean by trying to find out the what or the nature of a thing or a class of things. The connection between idea and nature appears in the Republic from the facts that the idea of justice is called that which is just by nature, and that the ideas, in contradistinction to the things which are not ideas or to the sensibly perceived things, are said to be in nature. This does not explain, however, why the ideas are presented as separated from the things which are what they are by participating in an idea, or in other words, why dogness, the class character of dogs, should be the true dog. It seems that two kinds of phenomena lend support to Socrates' assertion. In the first place, the mathematical things, as such, can never be found among sensible things. No line drawn on sand or paper is a line as meant by the mathematician. Secondly, and above all, what we mean by justice and kindred things is not, as such, in its purity or perfection, necessarily found in human beings or societies. It rather seems that what is meant by justice transcends everything which man can ever achieve. Precisely, the justice men were and are the ones most aware of the shortcomings of their justice. Socrates seems to say that what is patently true of mathematical things and of the virtues is true universally. There is an idea of the bed or the table, just as of the circle and of justice. Now, while it is obviously reasonable to say that a perfect circle or perfect justice transcends everything which can ever be seen, it is hard to say that the perfect bed is something on which no man can ever rest. However this may be, Glaucon and Adeimantos accept this doctrine of ideas with relative ease, with greater ease than absolute communism. This paradoxical fact does not strike us with sufficient force because we somehow believe that these able young men study philosophy under Professor Socrates and have heard him expound the doctrine of ideas on innumerable occasions. If we do not believe that the Republic is a philosophical treatise addressed to readers familiar with more elementary or earlier dialogues. Yet Plato addresses the readers of the Republic only through the medium of Socrates' conversation with Glaucon and the other interlocutors in the Republic, and Plato, as the author of the Republic, does not suggest that Glaucon, to say nothing of Adeimantos and the rest, had seriously studied the doctrine of ideas. Yet while Glaucon and Adeimantos cannot be credited with a genuine understanding of the doctrine of ideas, they have heard, and in a way they know, that there are gods like Dike or Right and Nike or Victory, who is not this or that victory or this or that statue of Nike, but a self-subsisting being which is the cause of every victory and which is of unbelievable splendor. More generally, they know that there are gods, self-subsisting beings, which are the causes of everything good, which are of unbelievable splendor, and which cannot be apprehended by the senses since they never change their form. This is not to deny that there is a profound difference between the gods as understood in the theology of the Republic and the ideas, or that in the Republic the gods are in a way replaced by the ideas. It is merely to assert that those who accept the theology and draw all conclusions from it are likely to arrive at the doctrine of ideas. End quote. Okay, so this is interesting. A couple things about this is interesting. He's kind of saying what the ideas are, and the ideas. So he's looking at justice, and he's saying that they're talking about whether or not the just city is possible. The just city can be brought about. But what we understand is that the whole question here, the whole purpose, is to discover what justice is, and what justice is on its own, for its own sake, not what justice is in a man or what justice is in a city, but more so what justice is as such. And so you're talking about a sort of justice that is detached from any actual manifestation of justice. And so this is a sort of a different question, because the premise here is that true and absolute justice as such cannot be completely manifested in any person or city or anything else. It is its own thing. Justice as such is not the same as justice manifested in a particular scenario. And so it's transcendent. And in the same way he talks about mathematics. So a line drawn in the sand or on a piece of paper, it looks like a line. We can call it a line. But what the mathematician means by a line is not the same thing. It's perfectly straight. And it doesn't waver at all. And it has no thickness because it's a one-dimensional thing. It has one direction. It's the x-axis. An xy graph is two-dimensional. An xyz graph is three-dimensional. An x line with zero variation in any of its other dimensions is a one-dimensional line. It has no thickness. It's a sequence of points. An infinite sequence of an infinitely divisible sequence of points. And that's not the same thing as the line that you draw on a piece of paper. The line that you draw on a piece of paper can represent the mathematical line. But the mathematical line and the mathematical circle and the mathematical triangle are concepts that are only imperfectly represented in the material world, right? The line, the number, the circle, these things are transcendent. In the same way that justice is transcendent. And then the question then is like, oh, can this be carried over to dogs? Is it the case that the true dog is transcendent and that every dog on the earth is an imperfect manifestation of some transcendent dog? How much can you take this and spread it around to various things, to ideas? The concept of equality is only imperfectly manifested by two equal things, or the concept of big is only imperfectly manifested by big things, but bigness as such is transcendent. How much can you spill this over into everything else? And that's an important question. And the guys that Socrates is talking to, they just accept this theory of ideas very easily. And Leo Strauss is saying, well, why would they accept that so quickly and so easily? And he says, well, these are people that live in a pagan world. And there are gods such as Dike, which represents justice, basically. Dike, the goddess of justice. Nike, you've heard of Nike. Nike, the goddess of victory, represents victory, represents justice, represents these certain things, and has a lot of the same qualities of transcendent and a sort of perfect representation of victory. And we talked before about things like pathos, persuasion, that goes from an idea, a concept, an activity, and over time becomes manifested as a goddess. And it's kind of like there's a couple things going on here. There's justice as a quality of an existing thing, justice as a quality of a city, a quality of a man, justice as such, which is, extrapolated from its manifestations in men and in cities. And then there's Dike, the goddess of justice. And one has to sort of wonder how much they are interrelated with one another and whether or not the ideas is actually really kind of a sort of secularized version of the gods and goddesses. The various things that are parts of human existence, justice, victory, right? Victory is a thing that happens in the world, and nobody would know victory except from seeing it happen in reality. And they can extrapolate from the real facts, the material facts of victory, to a concept of victory that is not dependent on any particular victory, to a transcendent ideal of victory to a goddess of victory. And I think it's interesting how he relates them together. And I feel like this is an interesting point that I would like to explore further, because I've talked a little bit about ancient Greek religion and polytheism and paganism. And I've also talked about, my own sort of essentially materialist, secular understanding of reality. I'm skeptical about Plato's theory of forms. I'm skeptical about gods and goddesses as transcendent supernatural entities. But I'm not really skeptical that there's something, somehow, that is victory. That is, right, a concept that is more than just victory in, as manifested in this way or that way. And so it's sort of it kind of winds up merging into something like a Jungian archetype, I think. Some sort of a psychological concept or framework or way of understanding the world that's in a sense embedded in our minds that we can't help but recognize, or maybe it's a sort of archetypal structure of reality. So while I'm skeptical of the theory of forms as Plato presents it, and especially when he starts getting into, spreading it around and saying that there's some sort of archetypal form, there's some sort of idealized form of a bed or a house that is like the true ultimate house, somehow more real than the material houses around us. There's a lot of questions in my mind, and yet I'm compelled to want to explore a little bit further and pin it down in a way that is doesn't demand another realm, doesn't demand a higher realm with more that's more real than this material realm that we live in. In order to like conceptualize victory or justice or the circle or the square, they don't require a higher realm. They only require the human mind. So, anyway, with all that said, the next section I want to look at does talk again about the possibility of the just city, or the possibility of the manifestation of pure justice. He says, quote, "We must now return to the question of the possibility of the just city. We have learned that justice itself is not possible in the sense that anything which comes into being can ever be perfectly just. We learn immediately afterward that not only justice itself, but also the just city, is not possible in the sense indicated. This does not mean that the just city, as meant and as sketched in the Republic, is an idea like justice itself, and still less that it is an ideal. Ideal is not a Platonic term. The just city is not a self-subsisting being, like the idea of justice, located, so to speak, in a superheavenly place. Its status is rather like that of a painting, of a perfectly beautiful human being, i.e., it is only by virtue of the painter's painting. More precisely, the just city is only in speech. It is only by virtue of having been figured out, with a view to justice itself, or to what is by nature right on the one hand, and the human all too human on the other. Although the just city is decidedly of lower rank than justice itself, even the just city, as a pattern, is not capable of coming into being as it has been blueprinted. Only approximations to it can be expected in cities which are in deed and not merely in speech. What this means is not clear. Does it mean that the best feasible solution will be a compromise, so that we must become reconciled to a certain degree of private property? For example, that we must permit every warrior to keep his shoes and the like as long as he lives, and a certain degree of inequality of the sexes, for example, that certain military and administrative functions will remain in the preserve of the male warriors. There is no reason to suppose that this is what Socrates meant. In the light of the succeeding part of the conversation, the following suggestion would seem to be more plausible. The assertion, according to which the just city cannot come into being as blueprinted, is provisional, or prepares the assertion that the just city, while capable of coming into being, is very unlikely to come into being. At any rate, immediately after having declared that only an approximation to the good city can reasonably be expected, Socrates raises the question, what feasible change in the actual cities will be the necessary and sufficient condition of their transformation into good cities? His answer is the coincidence of political power and philosophy. The philosophers must rule as kings, or the kings must genuinely and adequately philosophize. As we have shown in our summary of the first book of the Republic, this answer is not altogether surprising. If justice is less than giving or leaving to each what the law assigns to him, than the giving or leaving to each what is good for his soul, but what is good for his soul is the virtues, it follows that no one can be truly just who does not know the virtues themselves, or generally the ideas, or who is not a philosopher. End quote. So there's a sort of a shorter section there of the question of whether or not the just city can come about. The premise, of course, is that it has to be the closest approximation to it that could reasonably be expected would be when philosophers rule. The just city, he says it's not entirely completely impossible. It's just very unlikely for the just city to actually come about. But there's no reason why it's utterly impossible. But what would have to happen would be that the philosophers would have to be in charge. It'd have to be ruled by people who knew what the virtues were and were capable of ruling according to this knowledge of virtue. I've always found this sort of peculiar and yet also unsurprising that the philosopher Plato puts forward the theory that no city is ever going to really be just or correct or good until people like him are put in charge. It's always seemed like an interesting coincidence. The city must be ruled by philosophers, says the philosopher. I've always thought that was strange. I think that there are some cities that are better and some cities that are worse. And maybe it does have to do with the wisdom of the people in charge. But people are human, all too human, like he says. People are corrupt. The idea that has gone into the founding of the United States and that has become a major part of more modern political theory of abandoning this idea that we're just going to wait for the perfect philosopher to come in to power, or we're going to teach the king to become a philosopher, but instead we're just going to have competing factions and checks and balances where no faction is ever allowed to totally gain control because they have their allocated domains, and yet they're always sort of struggling on the margins for power. And they're always in that way able to sort of keep one another in check. It actually has worked pretty well. It's more realistic. It's more in accord with human nature. Everyone's submitting themselves and obeying the dictates of a tyrannical philosopher has always seemed unlikely to me and not in accord with human nature. So that's all I'm going to say about that section there. The last section I'm going to read is when he talks about the laws, his other book about this sort of thing. And I don't want to spend a tremendous amount of time on that, but I do want to mention it. He says, quote, "The Laws is the only political work proper of Plato. It is the only Platonic dialogue from which Socrates is absent. The characters of the Laws are old men of long political experience, a nameless Athenian stranger, the Cretan Cleinias, and the Spartan Megillos. The Athenian stranger occupies the place ordinarily occupied in the Platonic dialogues by Socrates. The conversation takes place far away from Athens, on the island of Crete, while the three old men walk from the city of Knossos to the cave of Zeus. Our first impression is that the Athenian stranger has gone to Crete in order to discover the truth about those Greek laws which in one respect were the most renowned, for the Cretan laws were believed to have had their origin in Zeus, the highest god. The Cretan laws were akin to the Spartan laws, which were even more renowned than the Cretan laws, and were traced to Apollo. At the suggestion of the Athenian, the three men converse about laws and regimes. The Athenian learns from the Cretan that the Cretan legislator has framed all his laws with a view to war. By nature, every city is at all times in a state of undeclared war with every other city. Victory in war, and hence war, is the condition for all blessings. The Athenian easily convinces the Cretan that the Cretan laws aim at the wrong end. The end is not war, but peace. For if victory in war is the condition of all blessings, war is not the end. The blessings themselves belong to peace. Hence, the virtue of war, courage, is the lowest part of virtue, inferior to moderation, and above all, to justice and wisdom. Once we have seen the natural order of the virtues, we know the highest principle of legislation. For that legislation must be concerned with virtue, with the excellence of the human soul rather than with any other goods, is easily granted by the Cretan gentleman Cleinias, who was assured by the Athenian that the possession of virtue is necessarily followed by the possession of health, beauty, strength, and wealth. It appears that both the Spartan and the Cretan legislators, convinced as they were that the end of the city is war and not peace, provided well for the education of their subjects or fellows to courage, to self-control regarding pains and fears, by making them taste the greatest pains and fears. But they did not provide at all for education to moderation, to self-control regarding pleasures, by making them taste the greatest pleasures. In fact, if we can trust Megillos, at any rate the Spartan legislator discouraged the enjoyment of pleasure altogether. The Spartan and Cretan legislators surely forbade the pleasures of drinking, pleasures freely indulged in by the Athenians. The Athenian contends that drinking, even drunkenness, properly practiced, is conducive to moderation, the twin virtue of courage. In order to be properly practiced, drinking must be done in common, i.e., in a sense in public so that it can be supervised. Drinking, even drunkenness, will be salutary if the drinkers are ruled by the right kind of man. For a man to be a commander of a ship, it is not sufficient that he possess the art or science of sailing. He must also be free from seasickness. Art or knowledge is likewise not sufficient for ruling a banquet. Art is not sufficient for ruling any association, and in particular the city. The banquet is a more fitting simile of the city than the ship of state, for just as the banqueteers are drunk from wine, the citizens are drunk from fears, hopes, desires, and aversions, and are therefore in need of being ruled by a man who is sober. Since banquets are illegal in Sparta and Crete, but legal in Athens, the Athenian is compelled to justify an Athenian institution. The justification is a long speech, and long speeches were Athenian, rather than Spartan or Cretan. The Athenian is then compelled to justify an Athenian institution in an Athenian manner. He is compelled to transform his non-Athenian interlocutors, to some extent, into Athenians. Only in this way can he correct their erroneous views about laws, and therewith eventually their laws themselves. From this we understand better the character of the laws as a whole. In the Republic, the Spartan and Cretan regimes were used as examples of timocracy, the kind of regime inferior only to the best regime, but by far superior to democracy, i.e., the kind of regime which prevailed in Athens during most of Socrates and Plato's lifetime. In the laws, the Athenian stranger attempts to correct timocracy, i.e., to change it into the best possible regime, which is somehow in between democracy and the best regime of the Republic. That best possible regime will prove to be very similar to the ancestral regime, the pre-democratic regime of Athens. End quote. So that's not an awful lot there, but one thing that I thought was interesting is that what the quality that is required of the leader, as described here, is that he be sober, that the citizens are drunk on their fears and their hopes and everything else, and that the leader has to be sober, has to be more sober. And the idea also that in order to be courageous, one must face fear and practice facing fear as a youth in order to develop the sense of courage. And yet the Cretan and the Spartan don't believe that someone can learn moderation by being exposed to pleasures. In the same way that courage allows one to resist fear and they're exposed to fearful situations to build up their courage, it's not the same case, according to the Spartan and the Cretan, that one should be exposed to pleasures in order to build up one's resistance to pleasures. But the Athenian argues in favor of drinking and banquets, and I think probably along those sort of similar lines. But the Athenian is advocating for Athenian things. He is advocating for banquets. He's advocating for long speeches. The Athenian is Athenian, and he is sharing the Athenian way with these other people. And they're trying to kind of pinpoint what the best sort of regime is. They're not trying to grasp hold of justice or any other transcendent concept and using the regime or using the city in order to pinpoint it. But it seems as though they're just having a discussion about what the best regime is. And they look at different types: democracy, timocracy. Timocracy essentially being a state governed by honor, glory, not necessarily bound to one particular person or whatever, but perhaps like people who have achieved glory in war. A state that seems to be like respectful of war, glory, conquest, things of that nature, manly virtues. Somewhere between that and what is described as the Republic in the Republic seems to be pinned down as the best regime. But I just find it interesting that they're really like what makes a regime best, virtuous and capable. But I think it's interesting. This is one of Plato's later writings. It's a long work. It's one of his later writings when he's an old man. The characters are old men. In the Republic, the characters are generally speaking young men. And I think it's interesting how one's philosophy can sort of change as one gets older. One's disposition toward things can change as one gets older. And the disposition of the laws seems to be more inclined toward what is possible, not so idealistic, but more realistic, more cognizant of common sense, less transcendent and high-flying rhetoric seems to be used. Again, I haven't read the laws, and so I can only speak so much on it, but it makes one wonder why the Republic is so elevated all the time in political theory, and the laws seems to be treated as a sort of footnote, like, oh, Plato also has this other book, but nobody really talks about it that much. And I wonder if our civilization itself has gone down one path with its focus on the Republic as the original political document, whereas if we had looked at the laws as the original political document, if we had said as a civilization, that the Republic is the work of a man who is still learning and who is still trying to figure things out and is sort of throwing things at the wall to see what sticks, is putting out wild hypotheses and then examining them and turning them over and seeing how they feel and whether they work and what sort of implications they have. Whereas the laws is something that was written by a man who is experienced, who knows a bit more about the way of the world. Wouldn't one think that a later work, a later political theory, would be more learned, more knowledgeable about the ways of the world, and probably a better source of political thought than one that was written by a young man? Wouldn't one sort of think that the older Plato has better things to say than the younger Plato? Perhaps. And there's just a number of interesting things that come up from this. I'm reminded of the Reveries of the Solitary Walker, where when Rousseau is old, he just trusts himself a little bit more. And perhaps Plato, when he is older, he is more inclined to trust the existing regimes and to compare the existing regimes and try to maybe extract what is best from the existing regimes, because he's more inclined to just say, well, the people who have been doing this across the Greek world and across the whole world for hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands of years, they must have figured something out. In a sense, the existing regimes are the accumulation of all the wisdom of the past, and he seems a little bit more open to the idea that the regimes that are out there, that are possible, are probably more worthy of study than the regime that I just invented in my head. It just seems more tempered and stable than the Republic. And it makes me think about what the consequences are of writing political theory when there have been all sorts of regimes throughout history that have been influenced by Plato. What responsibility does Plato have to future generations when people try to implement some of his early ideas that were untested and perhaps maybe even immature, maybe just not as wise as his later ideas? Does he have responsibility for the things that have come after? Is it irresponsible for a philosopher to put out philosophies of politics when a young man and in an inexperienced state and in perhaps less wise or less moderate state? Is it reasonable, is it responsible to put out extreme theories in your youth when you haven't had the experience of old age to give you that sort of wisdom? And when people follow your wild theories, do you bear any responsibility for that? Should you be cautious in your political theory, knowing that people will take you seriously? It's an interesting question, and with that, I'm going to wrap this episode up. I thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time.